You see that? Or you see everything?
We see your text too. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, I don't want to see that. Okay, where was I? So to what ends do they seek this, this new ground, or seek it again? Why does Dubuffet invent the notion of art brut, or raw art? What does Bataille seek in the prehistoric cave paintings of France? Why does Jorn populate his cobra paintings with creaturely figures? What does Paolozzi see in his monsters assembled from industrial debris? And why does Oldenburg remake everyday products from urban scrap? To begin again is almost a contradiction in terms. These figures want a clean slate, only to find an overwritten one. They seek foundations, only to find that they are equivocal. Like Robinson Crusoe, whom Dubuffet and Oldenburg adopt as a persona, each washes up on an island of his own devising, only to discover that it too is treacherous terrain. Among the tricky questions I encountered are these. How could Dubuffet imagine an art that is unscathed? Let me just go back. What did Bataille hope to unlock in the enigma of a first man depicted in the guise of a creature? Why did Jorn figure political crisis in the form of human animals? How did Paolozzi pick out a path to survival through the destruction all around him? And why did Oldenburg stake his hope for metamorphosis in junk? Some of my figures, such as Dubuffet and Oldenburg, are well known. Others, such as Jorn and Paolozzi, less so. In each case, though, I focus on early work and highlight aspects that are less familiar. In doing so, I hope to reposition, even to revalue these artists. At the same time, I don't apologize for the ways that they, all straight white men, are marked by the racism and sexism of their time. My book has a more general stake as well. Most accounts of the avant-garde see it as located in two ways only: as vanguard, in a position of radical innovation, or as resistant, in a position of stern refusal to the status quo. My guard is neither avant nor rear in these senses. It is caustically imminent. Typically, too, the avant-garde is seen to be driven by two motives only: the transgression of a given symbolic order, as with surrealism, or the legislation of a new one, as with Russian constructivism. The avant-garde that concerns me is again different. Not heroic, it doesn't pretend that it can break absolutely with the old order or found a new one. Rather, it seeks to trace fractures that already exist within the given order, to pressure them further, even to activate them somehow. And here I think there is a resonance with contemporary practice. Rob, over to you, and I think I can just continue with the slideshow that I have. You call out your slides.
Okay, well, thank you, Hal, and thank you, Maris, and everyone at McNally Jackson for hosting this event. So if you could put on the next slide. I think my book and Hal's book are very, not, I wouldn't say similar, but address a similar question, which is, how does one produce art in the wake of trauma in most general sense, and in particular, the trauma of the Second World War? And for me, the question was answered in terms of the model of the monument. The monument being a form, a sculptural form that has a certain kind of association with the memorialization of war and kind of military history. And it struck me when I began thinking about this question, how many artists actually engaged with the form explicitly. Barnett Newman's Broken Obelisk, maybe one of the most obvious examples, but then someone like Claes Oldenburg's Placid Civic Monument, where he hires Union grave diggers to dig a grave in Central Park behind the Met. I love this juxtaposition because you can actually see the Cleopatra's Needle, the traditional obelisk alongside Newman's. And this brings me to the point that these are not just, these are in some ways counter monuments, or not even monuments, but rather I would call them examples of monumentalism. They're like monuments, they're sculptural monuments. And beyond the association with war, I was interested in the fact that something like an obelisk is a form of sculpture that is abstract and yet still can be representational, or at least still signifies, it's still figurative. And that seemed very important to me. And again, I think that's something that both my corpus and the artist that Hal is writing about shares, an interest in figuration in some ways. But most importantly, the monument became, I think, a privileged genre for these sculptors in the post-war era because of its engagement with time. The monument has a kind of Janus-faced temporality. It points to the past, to a past moment that it seeks to commemorate, and then it always looks into the future, into its kind of future preservation. And the crucial issue after 1945 and the United States use of the atomic bomb in Japan was, what does it mean to make a monument, this form that has a kind of rhetoric of, if not eternity, at least a kind of future preservation, when the question of the future of humanity seemed highly precarious. And in some ways, you can see this played out very explicitly in these two introductory examples. The broken obelisk with the kind of jagged top that seems to suggest that it was actually kind of lifted from a site and moved and inverted. And of course, Oldenburg associating his monument with kind of funerary practices and funerary architecture. There's kind of morbidity to much of this work. So with that, maybe I can kind of just go through some of the other examples. Maybe one other thing to say about both of these works is that they suggest a certain kind of ephemerality. Oldenburg's work, after the grave diggers dig the grave, they cover it up, and the work kind of returns to a state of nature. And with Newman, this kind of sense of dereliction, the sense of ruination. It's simulated. Even Newman's use of Corten steel, a rather new material that kind of comes encrusted with a layer of rust, so that these works almost imagine themselves in a state of future dereliction. So Hal, could you go to the next? And so the first body of work that I look at are these sculptors emerging out of World War II, many of them actually trained as welders during the war. Both David Smith and Theodore Rozak worked in kind of munition factories during the war. And so there's an affinity between their chosen medium, which is welded steel, something that comes out of kind of Picasso and Cubist sculpture, but it seems to have distinctly kind of militaristic and technological connotations. And both Smith and Rozak in these works seem to be aligning the torch, the welding torch, with a kind of violence. And of course, this plays out even more so in their iconography, these ideas of specters and hawks and birds that seem to speak to what could be called a kind of aerial terror, right? The idea of bombardment. And this speaks to a larger theme that runs throughout my book, which is the way that sculpture in particular, one of the questions is, why sculpture? Why write a medium-specific history in 2020? But sculpture seems to not only speak to the activation of space, and I'm kind of interested in what Stanley Cavell would call the phenomenology of the bomb, the way that space itself becomes innervated and activated in the age of nuclear war, but also the way that sculpture does seem to have this relationship to technology in a way that painting doesn't, that it does have not just technology, but even military technology in some ways. And maybe finally, that with something like direct metal welding, where sculpture becomes often hollow, it has negative space, it moves sculpture away from the tradition of statuary, the kind of most traditional understanding of what sculpture is, and into another tradition of three-dimensional practice, which is weaponry. And artists like Smith and Rozak seem to make this relationship between sculpture and the weapon. And it's something that we saw with Oldenburg in his collection of ray guns. So this is something else I think that we can consider as well. Next slide, please. And with this, I am interested in the presence of these strategies of what I call kind of anticipated dereliction or simulated dereliction. Artists on the left, Raoul Haig, who finds hardwood trees in Woodstock and carves them into these almost kind of imaginary archaeological fragments. So the idea that these are kind of works that almost imagine their future state of ruination. It's as if, as Albert Einstein famously said, I don't know what they're going to fight World War III with, but World War IV will be fought with stones and sticks. The idea that in some ways we already know the idea that the Third World War is inevitable. It's not a matter of when, but if. And then there will be some kind of new civilization that would be a kind of almost primeval civilization. I think Haig's work speaks to that kind of fantasy of a kind of archaeological fragment. On the right, Peter Grippi's City, a work that also seems to imagine itself in a future discovery. If you can see in the detail, Grippi incises into the terracotta dates from the past and the future. So the idea that he's kind of imagining this work kind of existing into a future that may or may not exist. I like these two slides also because they show the works in museum storage. These are many of the artists that I'm interested in, with the exception of Smith from this generation, have mostly been kind of lost to oblivion, which is something I'm very interested in. What is it about this work that has made it seem in some ways unfashionable? I mean, in some ways, I think the answer is minimalism, that has made this work seem a little too humanistic and obsolete. But I'm interested in the fact that maybe that obsolescence is actually part of the work's intentional meaning, that in the way that they imagine the possible extinction of the human race, and that the obsolescence is actually part of it. And that's really been part of the excitement of this work, is kind of discovering this body of work that hasn't seen the light of day. And maybe, hopefully, this book might bring Haig's really powerful sculpture out of storage in MoMA, and Peter Grippi's. Actually, MoMA owns one of Grippi's as well. I don't know the last time that's been shown either. Next slide. And just one other kind of lost artist of this period a little later, Robert Mallory, who made these really kind of daunting sculptures made out of tuxedos drenched in resin and then kind of frozen into these rather expressionistic postures. This was a work that was actually shown at the 1964 World's Fair, famously at the New York State Theater, with other artists like Warhol and Rosenquist, and quite different than many of the other artists, a rather downbeat image, again, of kind of the world on edge. And this, of course, is just 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to kind of put that into perspective, that even after the United States' use of the atomic bomb, these fears still percolate throughout culture. And this is a work that's, because of the materials that Mallory used, has more or less been degraded. It has its own destruction built into the materials. And this leads me to my next body of work, land artists like Robert Smithson and Michael Heitzer, artists who seem to engage with the tradition of the ruin. Smithson's partially buried woodshed, which was created at Kent State University in 1970. He hires a truck to dump an amount of soil on top of this woodshed on the edge of campus until the beam of the woodshed breaks, with the understanding that then the work will slowly, this building will slowly return to the state of nature and disappear. And this idea of the entropic work of art. And of course, Heitzer doing the same thing in the Nevada desert, perhaps maybe importantly, not too far away from where the United States Air Force was testing atomic weapons. Both of these works have a kind of built-in disappearance into their very own into their structure. The idea that the ruin is a work of humanity that over time returns to the state of nature, where it no longer even is recognizable as a work of art. And this relates to Smithson's interest in the concept of entropy, which is often understood in terms of this idea of ruination and degradation, but in fact has much more to do with a kind of de-differentiation, a kind of return to a state of sameness, and even has its own basis in, at least as it was understood in cybernetic terms through someone like Norbert Wiener, it has its own basis in military technology in terms of the idea of prediction. And one of the things I'm interested in is in the way that artists like Smithson, in their use of entropy and in the way of kind of bringing these works into time, invest a new sense of fate into these works. That is to say that, of course, humanity has for a long time thought about apocalyptic ends of the world, but what changes in 1945 and continues to inform our contemporary existence is that it's no longer going to be a metaphysical or divine power. It's actually humanity itself that's going to destroy itself, so that what seems like something that was once fateful in the hands of the gods is now fateful in the hands of man and actually has a kind of inevitability to it. And then finally, kind of moving into the realm of minimalism, thinking about artists like Dan Flavin, whose use of the fluorescent light bulb itself has a kind of entropic end date, right? These are works that will burn out. And Flavin knew this and actually invited that possibility, that these were monuments that were not built for the ages, as Smithson would say. And moreover, to see these in terms of minimalism and the installation shot at primary structures, one of the major kind of first shows of this style, even the site specificity of these works, the fact that each installation of them would be different, suggests that there's no permanent semblance to them. So that the kind, again, this is a kind of reconsideration of the monument, which evacuates its rhetoric of permanence and timelessness. And I would say in some ways is also trying to posit a different model of the work of art, a work of art that might not be eternal. And I think for many of these artists, that would suggest a different sort of society. And it's a society that I think speaks to a certain stridency that runs through all of the art that I consider in this book, which I borrow a term from the architect Buckminster Fuller. He says, he has an essay from 1964 called Utopia or Oblivion, which is to say that we either learn to live with one another peacefully and distribute resources equitably, or we destroy ourselves. That seems to be the kind of Manichaean divide. And I argue in my book that images like these installation shots of early minimalist work, which were seen as quite threatening. I think this is something, when you walk through the Judge show at MoMA right now, people say how beautiful and how sensuous the work is. But when original audiences saw these works, they found them very threatening, I think partially because, as you can see in the kind of way that Flavin's work even makes the question of where the art is and where the decoration is in the fireplace problematic. That was part of the threat, was that the boundary of where the aesthetic experience began and end was unclear. But that threat, I would argue, has something to do with the stridency, which is to say that I would say these kind of minimalist installations that almost seem like empty rooms imagine the world either without possessions, which would be the kind of utopian world where war is not necessary, or they imagine the world without people. The kind of the last scene in Planet of the Apes, where you see the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and you think, my God, right? That I think is something of the affect of minimalism that we have lost since its canonization in the 70s. So I'll end with that, but I thought maybe how we could begin our conversation talking about this question of trauma, because I do think that is maybe the basis for both of our, like I said, the corpus in some ways, that both of these books are in some ways thinking about how to respond to trauma. So I don't know if you want to kind of speak to how your artists, if that is a kind of key term for you.
Sure. Do you want me to leave up the slides, or should I take them down at this point so we can see each other?
Why don't we take them down?
Okay. Yeah, there are these points in common between our books, but they're quite different too. And they're different on the subject of trauma. It really interests me how, for you, the trauma is a threat. It hasn't occurred yet. It's in the future. So for me, that's a paradoxical idea of the traumatic, the not yet arrived. In my instance, for my artists, again, mostly European, the trauma is lived experience. And the difficulty, at least according to Freud, of trauma is that it provokes a defense for an event that has already happened. So it's useless and just repeated again and again. And that might be a little bit why my artists tend to be stuck in time. I think they're stuck in terms of history. They've given up on a sense of a dialectic of history. I think they're also stuck politically, but that is one difference between our two groups.
You say, actually, I think in the introduction, maybe it's in your discussion of Plato, that you talk about the traumatic dimension of political power. And I think this speaks to the question of sovereignty.
Right. That was a real surprise as I worked in this book. I didn't really expect the question of power, how authority is figured, to come into play. Obviously, this was a concern of Bataille throughout, but I didn't expect it on the part of the artists. But it came in and wouldn't go away. And if you think about our period, it's a time when there's great uncertainty as to what sovereignty, what proper rule can be. Liberal democracies are, they won in a way the war, but they were devastated too. Nazism and fascism were defeated, but not entirely. There was the specter of the totalitarian Soviet Union. So I was struck by how artists that I didn't think were manifestly political touched on this subject. But that, to throw it back to you, maybe an equivalent concern or related concern in your book is with the monument. I mean, most of us learn that modern sculpture begins with the fall of the monument, but you put it, right at the center of your book. It's one thing that makes your work seem like kind of new art history for this period. For me, it was a surprise that the figuration of power comes back. For you, I would think, it's a bit of a shock that the question of the monument would return. So tell us about why that happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I guess we all kind of think about, that's the kind of narrative that's contained in Krauss's diagram of sculpture, the expanded field, in some ways, that suggests that with modern sculpture, the kind of the fact that it can now become nomadic and move makes it no longer related to the monument in some ways. And of course, modernism's own kind of skepticism towards authority, seems to speak to its anti-monumental ethos.
Right.
That I think in that gets to the question of sovereignty. I mean, obviously, I think these are artists who are not, they're making ironic, I think I say at one point, ironic and irenic monuments. Irenic is this great word I learned from Dan Graham in one of his essays on monumentality, right? Which speaks to peacefulness, right? What would it mean to make a placid monument, as Oldenburg wants to make? It's paradoxical, because it seems like the monument, in its very rhetoric of permanence, is inherently violent. I just read something that the late great David Graeber wrote, where he said something like, any monument that claims for eternal significance is a fraud. And I think that's right, that these are artists who are using the monument not only to subvert its rhetoric of authority and eternal significance, but also to, I think, suggest a different model of what a work of art could be. I mean, this is where I think to me, the most radical consequences of this reinvestigation of the monument is, I think about Jansen's book, Monuments of Art History. Somehow this is really not even about monuments. This is about what a work of art could be, and what would it mean to make a work of art that disappears, that isn't for the ages, that doesn't have a permanent semblance in some ways, and what kind of society would allow for such a different model. So I mean, to me, there are political implications to this reconsideration of the monument that maybe have something to do with sovereignty, but certainly have something to do with possessiveness that I think is important.
Right, and there's also a concern that we share, which is a new or different sense of temporality in this period, at least in the art. We both talk about this turn to prehistory that somehow goes beyond the primitivism of the moderns, or the turn even to the peasants in the 19th century. But that prehistory, which in my book is strongest in Bataille, really does enter the caves. That prehistory is connected to a post-history. Like it's almost as if the specter of the end of man compels an investigation into the beginnings. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of double temporality? You mentioned it in relation to monumentalism, that it reaches back, but also scans ahead.
Yeah. I mean, again, this another, I think, really exciting moment for me thinking through this work, and particularly Smithson's work, was the realization that there is, we talk so much about Smithson as a paradigmatic postmodernist. We understand postmodern to be a kind of critique of grand narratives and the critique of teleology, but in fact, Smithson, as a practitioner of entropic art, actually engages in a kind of end-based practice, in the sense that entropy does, I mean, the great entropic dynamism is the ultimate heat death of the universe, right? Which plays out macrocosmically, but then kind of plays out as well in everyone's life, right? So that there's a kind of predictive fate that Smithson sees, I think, allegorized, or I think one could say that sense of entropic fate then becomes aligned with humanity's relationship to technology. The bomb becomes in some ways the epitome of humanity's relationship to technology, which is ultimately not only self-destructive, and of course it might not be the bomb, it might be global warming, but we're still living in that kind of entropic, fateful relationship to technology. But moreover, it suggests a kind of de-differentiation. And this is why Smithson so strangely says that minimalist artists like Judd and Flavin are entropic, which doesn't really make sense when you first think about it, because their work doesn't seem to have the kind of ruinous semblance. But what I think he's suggesting is that it's prophetic in the sense that the kind of serial, industrial, even geometric regularity of this work is imagining a future in which kind of technological homogenization will create a world where, you know, all the buildings look the same. Every corner has a Starbucks. You know, there's something strangely prophetic about minimalism in the way that it imagines this kind of homogeneous future.
Right.
And maybe the last thing to say is that in that homogeneous future, time no longer matters because everything's the same, right? That entropy is not only a kind of de-differentiation of space, but a de-differentiation of time.
One thing that struck me about your book, and this is from a different generation, my own, to connect the minimalists to the sculpture of the 1950s. Of course, people like Judd would have hated that idea.
Yeah.
But you make the case that there are these connections. And I'm convinced, but I wonder if we should talk a little bit about how we came to these projects, because they're not obvious periods of concern. I mean, for my generation of art historians and art critics, often the 50s dropped out. I mean, they were seen more or less in terms of different recoveries of Duchamp, but the models of the historical avant-garde or the neo-avant-garde or modernism and postmodernism tended to skip over the material that interests us in these books. And partly, my project was to recoup that miss in my own work. But I wonder why you were drawn to this work, which I have to say, I mean, my work, the work that I take up, is often very ugly. Your work is often very dreadful.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, part of the challenge of working on this material was kind of developing a taste for it, finding the right criteria to understand its achievement and its intelligence. I think that was part of the excitement. I mean, I didn't intend to write a book about sculpture. I didn't intend to write a book about the 50s. I thought I was going to write a book about minimalism. And that's really where I started thinking about that. And it became clear as I began working that in order to tell the story of how minimalism might have related to the Vietnam War, that's really how I started. It was like, how could have primary structures taken place in 1967 at the kind of height of the Vietnam War? And how can you reconcile those two events? But I realized that, that story had to be imploded within a much longer story about sculpture. I think both of our books are presenting kind of alternative histories of post-war art, which is this body of work that I think, as both of us who are professors know, you feel like there are too many people writing about it, too many students thinking about it. There's, and there's a lot of received ideas. But I think both of our projects suggest that there's still a lot of material out there that people have overlooked. And I think both of our projects also suggest that, and maybe this gets to your question about the relationship between the kind of schmaltzy, humanistic 50s sculpture that I write about, Seymour Lipton, Herbert Ferber, the dentist artists, and Judd and Smithson and these kind of good objects, and one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is not only how they both were very much interested in similar questions about time and kind of humanity's relationship to technology, but I think that they both had a kind of, if not expressive quotient that we are happy to see, and even in artists like Smith, but wouldn't want to recognize in Judd, that there's a kind of affect to this work. And I think your artists are very similar in that regard. That part of the reason I think the 50s are problematic for modernists is that there's something melodramatic about it. You know, you can even think about the cinema of the period. And we as modernists don't know what to do with the melodrama of this work.
It's true. I guess we should turn to questions if there are any out there, but I think before we do, because we did tend towards the self-congratulatory there for a minute or two, we should confront the problem that all our figures are white guys, maybe all straight white men. And well, like I can go first with I mean, I'm not sure if it's a defense. I'm not sure what to say really. It could be that the quest to start again, to find origins that become equivocal, become failed in a way that's a boy quest. It could be that, you know, the fascination with the end, almost the glory of destruction, that's a boy thing as well. That there's a weird kind of narcissism, you know, not only in the civilization, but in the spectacle of the civilization as it falls apart. I mean, one could say, oh, it somehow expresses a threat to masculinity. Like that might be a little facile. I mean, this is all to say I don't have a particularly good answer to that charge of why.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly have thought about this, and I mean, my work, even more than your work, is particularly the kind of 50 sculpture, is very kind of macho in an embarrassing way. And I think, you know, on one level, it's true that war is a conventionally masculine realm of culture. But I think even more importantly, these are artists who I think are, if not consciously, intuitively recognizing that it is Western culture, maybe the white man in particular, who is the motor for civilization self-destruction. Right? There's a certain culpability, I think, that is driving these projects. So I mean, that to me, and that's where my thinking is going more generally, is the way that you know, there's if not a pathos, there's at least a kind of self-recrimination in these practices that I'm interested in pursuing further.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think there's also this weird delight in if this is the end, I will go down with it, and it will all come down with me too. I mean,
that's right.
There's a kind of necro sublime that I feel in Smithson, but we should really open it up.
It's true though. It's taking the football and going home. That's what artists
or it's exploding the football and the stadium with it. Mars, you have a question?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of good questions. Here's one for Rob from Blake Gottnick. The end of the world role once played by the bomb is now played by climate change. Do you see echoes of 1950s work in the best work made today?
Well, I think it's not hard to see artists addressing climate change when you look at contemporary art. And I think the question is, what is the affect, you know, or how is it being addressed? I don't see the same kind of stridency. I don't see the same kind of sense of, you know, to me, what was so fascinating about this body of work is that there still is a sense that if we got our act together, we could solve the world's problem. Right? I mean, what's fascinating about the 60s for me as a historian is one still senses a certain kind of, if not utopianism, at least optimism, like the future might be better. You know, when I think about the figurations of global warming that I see in contemporary art now, it's much more dystopian. You know, there's still that kind of strident warning, look what's gonna happen. But you don't get the other side of the sense like we could still make things better. So I mean, that to me is, you know, what is the famous line about that Jameson says, right? It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think, that's what we're living through now, is that we're wallowing in visions of the end of the world. Maybe just in the last few years, we've begun to even try to imagine what the end of capitalism might look like. But the two are related.
Alex asks, Rob, Fuller's Utopia or Oblivion updates Corb's architecture or revolution. Can you reflect on the shift in these either or scenarios?
Oh, I think Hal should answer that one because he's more of the architectural historian. I don't know the Corb's essay, so I don't know if I can answer that.
It's the end of Towards the New Architecture, 1924, 1925. And his appeal is, and Le Corbusier was problematic politically. It was either, let me do my architecture, let me plan the city, or there will be revolution. Look to the east, look to the Soviet Union. So it was a bit of an ultimatum, really. Planning all of the West or planning all of the East, capitalist or Stalinist, which do you want? But how it relates to the Fuller, we should invite Alex to say. Or, I give you a few minutes to come up with a few moments to come up with an answer. So take a whack.
Well, I think the question, the question of where the Cold War, that's a word we haven't used yet, which is kind of remarkable in the fact that we've been talking about this body of work and not mentioned the Cold War at all. Mm-hmm. But this relates to the kind of perspective trauma that motivates my art, right? That the Cold War is a war meant to stave off a real war, and so there's always this kind of sense of looming possibility. But anyway,
for me, it's not. Well, go ahead.
I was going to just say that many of the artists, I think, have already, I think, are overtly, if not ardently, anti-communist. From, maybe Smith at first, but I think in general that's not the battle they're fighting. It's a much more humanistic battle, which transcends politics.
Yeah, that's largely true of my figures too, although Jorn was very much a Marxist. My figures have a very ambivalent relationship to humanism. Jorn says I'm an inhuman humanist. Oldenburg says I am a humanist bastard. But that's actually, where I might push back on your book a little bit, is that you want to push that humanism into the 60s, into the minimalists, and I don't so much. But my artists are very, very concerned to recover the human, to de-reify subject-object relations. Oldenburg is obsessed by this idea that they can be reanimated somehow. His great motto is annihilate, one must destroy, but also illuminate, and I think that different versions of that project run through all my artists. But in terms of the Cold War, I talked about how they felt stuck politically. I think that they did, by and large. The old connection between modernism and socialism that T.J. Clark wants to insist upon as absolutely essential to modernism, that's really broken for my group or that generation. Jorn attempts to hold on to the connection, but for the most part, it's broken. And Bataille has this extraordinary phrase which captures, I think, my entire group, which is, he speaks in a letter to Alexander Kojève, the great interpreter of Hegel, of his unemployed negativity. negativity, critique, without a project, without a political project. And I think that, again, holds for my generation.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this just gets back to Alex's question and Corbusier's planning, that one of the things, I mean, the monument has a certain association with notions of certainly publicness and maybe even collectivity. And that seems to be the thing that does fracture. And this idea that there's a kind of in some ways, the bomb and and this again even speaks to not only global warming but the pandemic, right? That this has to be solved globally. It cannot be solved on a national scale. But there's something about these artists that have something like minimal art both kind of imagines a kind of phenomenological, transcendental subject in some ways, or a subject that is equal in some ways, and yet at the same time it almost forecloses the possibility of a universal encounter with the work of art. And so the question of collectivity and universality, I think, is important.
Yeah, they're glimmers, they're intuitions of a collective in my group. It might not be very valid, but Dubuffet does look to the common man. When he takes up graffiti, for example, he wants a different relationship to a public. Jorn, practices collective forms, insists on collaboration again and again, in search of at least the figure of a collectivity, a model, a kind of micro community that could be a model for a community at large. But that too is difficult. And I think you're right. It speaks to the political difficulty of the period. I don't know if there are any questions up there.
Yeah, there's a question for both of you from Gabriel. It says, how do you move your work to speak to the present moments of crisis while staying historically based? I wonder also to what extent the question of skipped over artists, taken more fully across other periods and movements, might open art history further away from straight male white artists.
Rob, you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, the first part is it's easy, I think, because I do see my book as a kind of allegory. I mean, I see my practice as a historian as a kind of allegorical practice. That's to say that these works and thinking about these works does have something to say about our current moment. The fact that that we have been more or less at war overtly for 20 years and probably covertly since 1945, if not longer, suggests that this story that I'm telling in this book, I think, is important. And if we can consider when we walk into the Donald Judd exhibition at MoMA, that this might have something to do with our relationship to technology and the kind of technologically embedded destruction of our civilization, then I think I do think there is a relevance to thinking about these artists in terms of our present concerns. And the question of skipped over artists, many of the skipped over artists that I showed, like Grippy and Haig and Mallory, are themselves white men, so it doesn't quite play out in terms of bringing attention to previously marginalized demographics. But I think I think it does speak to something which has to do in a kind of Benjaminian sense of that these artists had something that was, their message was in some ways, there was something not only just unfashionable, but there was something almost truly traumatic about their message that almost required it to be repressed. And so, I mean, for me, part of the search for these forgotten artists has its own politics, in the sense that there might be a kind of, as Benjamin would say, a weak messianic message in this work. And I'm sure that other overlooked artists would have similar messages for us to consider in the present.
Should I take a whack at that question too, or?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, this book is part of a long project to do with art at times of emergency, and it began, soon after 9/11, when it was impossible not to think about states of emergency, states of exception. And that has led me to think about other moments when what counted as order, what counted as law was not clear. And this is why I focused on the immediate period after World War II. And then the next installment will really deal with the interwar period. Actually, will begin a little bit before World War I, where political emergency becomes the order of the day almost. But so for me, it's, and I think for Rob too, there's always a connection, or there should be a connection between critical engagement with contemporary practice and historical projects that open up. They resonate with each other, and I think that's important for both of us. In terms of the point about the skipped over, I take that point. The problem with my group, especially with a figure like Dubuffet, is that he is very alert to the marginal, and that's where he goes. I mean, he takes up the whole project of art brut as a way to look to the outlier, to the outsider. But in that very act, he also displaces them. And that's a common story with artists that interest me. Fascination with what lies outside, only for that outside to then be foreclosed. And I'm actually interested in that problem, so I tend to tarry with it, and rather than kind of seek out the truly marginal. I think progressive art history can work with canonical figures and revalue them, and that's work done, or it can claim figures who are not known, not seen as much. And I've tended to follow the first path rather than the second path.
I think that's our time, but thank you both so very much. This was fascinating. And thank you to the audience, and please buy books.
Yes.
At McNally Jackson. Thank you so much, Morris.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody.